Dr. Philip Gossett, professor of music and the humanities at the University of Chicago, is a regular contributor to these lyric opera broadcasts. Today he tells us how Bellini came to write his opera about the Capulets and the Montagues.
If I could offer a single piece of advice to help a modern audience approach Vincenzo Bellini's magnificent bel canto opera I Capuleti e I Montecchi, it would be to forget that Shakespeare ever wrote a play called Romeo and Juliet. The most extraordinary nonsense has been written over the past century and a half about this opera, much of it accusing Bellini and his librettist, Felice Romani, of having defiled the English dramatist's masterpiece. Yet neither Bellini nor Romani even knew the English tragedy. Few Shakespearean plays had crossed the Alps. Those that circulated did so in French versions far removed from the original. Bellini and Romani certainly knew the 16th century sources for the Romeo and Juliet story, those that inspired Shakespeare, including a short story by Matteo Bandello from 1554. When Romani's wife, Emilia Branca, published a book about her husband after his death, she cited Bandello by name. But Branca's words were not completely truthful. For Romani's version, in which Romeo has previously killed Capelio's son in battle, Tebaldo is betrothed to Giulietta, and Lorenzo is a doctor rather than a priest, is derived neither from Bandello nor other Renaissance stories and plays. Its direct source is Giulietta e Romeo, an Italian neoclassical tragedy by Luigi Scevola, published in Milan in 1818. From Scevola, Romani derived the shape of his libretto and copied many actual verses and turns of phrase. In presenting his libretto to Bellini, though, Romani was recycling a work that had already been set by another composer. Bellini returned the favor by adapting for his new opera many themes taken from an earlier opera that had failed to please the public. Yet the result of this collaboration was somehow a remarkable work of music drama. From the beginning of his career during the mid-1820s, Bellini tried to avoid the frenetic gyrations that drove composers like Donizetti and Pacini to write opera after opera to meet the needs of a voracious public. Only once did Bellini allow himself to be seduced into writing more than one opera in a year, and the result was his only true fiasco. Having premiered two successful works for the Teatro alla Scala of Milan, Il Pirata in October 1827 and La Straniera in February 1829, he was approached by the Teatro Ducale of Parma. Rossini had been commissioned to write an opera to inaugurate that theater, but preparations for William Tell in Paris made it impossible for him to fulfill this contract. Bellini and Romani agreed to step in at short notice. Their Zaira, based on a drama by Voltaire and first performed in May 1829, barely 3 months after La Straniera, disappeared without a trace. But not all its music had the same fate. Later that year, in December, Bellini traveled to Venice to mount a revival of Il Pirata. He knew that he might also be called upon to compose a new opera for the Teatro La Fenice. Pacini was supposed to write that opera, but first he had to complete a commission for Turin. Well, the Venetian impresario was so nervous that he offered Bellini a provisional contract on 5 January 1830. When no word was received from Pacini 2 weeks later, Bellini's contract took effect. The composer was not particularly happy as he wrote to a friend, "The government and practically all of Venice has entreated me that, should Pacini not come to write the new opera, I must do it in only 1 month. They've all beseeched me to do this as a favor for Venice, which would be content with whatever I could write in such a brief period. To win the public's heart, I accepted, and thus if that anti-gentleman Maestro Pacini doesn't come, all this toil will fall to me, and who knows how much unpleasantness with it." To cope with the imminent deadline, neither Bellini nor Romani faced the task afresh. Bellini drew melodic inspiration from the failed Zaira, while Romani revised a libretto he had prepared 5 years earlier for Nicola Vaccai. Many of Romani's dramaturgical changes are real improvements, especially in the second act. Romani omitted a choral passage that opened the act in Vaccai, and he eliminated a pointless aria in which Capello reacts to what he believes to be the death of his daughter. Instead of Romeo killing Tebaldo between the acts, as in Vaccai, the characters are brought together in a duet that develops into a violent confrontation, during which they learn of Giulietta's apparent death. Most important, Romani omits a final scene and aria for Giulietta alone that he had prepared for Vaccai. As a result, the lovers die together. In a printed preface to the libretto for I Capuleti e I Montecchi, Romani explained that both composer and librettist felt constrained by the pressure of time to extreme brevity. Yet Bellini and Romani made a virtue of this necessity. They concentrated the opera primarily on the two protagonists, and it is this concentration that helps to give I Capuleti e I Montecchi its poignant character. Vaccai's opera seems diffuse by comparison. In Bellini, nothing distracts us from the plight of the young lovers, and it is to give voice to their tragedy that the composer pours out a wealth of inspired melody and striking declamatory passages. Writing for a soprano in the role of Giulietta and a mezzo-soprano en travesti in the role of Romeo, Bellini could bring the voices into close proximity, as in this soaring melody they sing in unison that concludes the first act. It actually comes from a trio to much the same text in Zaira. Listen to the wonderful way in which the melody builds from phrase to phrase, and the way Bellini ornaments the tune with triplets, then with even faster notes. He also provides strong contrasts between the characters. Romeo sings forceful melodies in his duet with Tebaldo, and in this martial cabaletta in his entrance aria. These tunes are profoundly different from the languid melodies of Giulietta in her cavatina, borrowed in part from Bellini's very first opera, Adelson e Salvini, and in this aria that opens the second act. Here are the beautiful, largely declamatory melodies of its first section and its second section, a slow cabaletta. Notice how Bellini gives the piece its unified character by having both melodies begin with the same rhythm. Even though individual ideas may be borrowed from Zaira, the composer absorbs them into a unified spirit that dominates the new work. In the final scene, the two voices sing an intimate and touching series of phrases and half-phrases before Bellini brings them briefly together, then separates them forever. Capuleti e I Montecchi had its premiere on 11 March 1830, and its success was enormous. For the most part, it cast into shadow Vaccai's Giulietta e Romeo, but a famous prima donna of the time failed to appreciate the intensely dramatic conclusion of Bellini's opera. Maria Malibran, in the role of Romeo, felt that Bellini did not provide an adequate opportunity for her to display her vocal skills. Beginning in 1832, she concluded the opera instead by interpolating Vaccai's death scene into Bellini's score. But not everyone approved. And in June 1834, the singer Giuseppina Ronzi de Begnis, who performed the role in Florence, wrote this fine letter. It should be taken to heart by every conductor who feels the urge to manipulate an operatic score and by every singer who demands alterations in her part. The third act, that is the tomb scene, was supposed to fail, but it did not fail. Here they had been saying that Vaccai's is better, and they wanted Ronzi to do the pasticcio alla Malibran. But I replied, if I make a fiasco, at least it will be all Bellini. I assure you, I was trembling, as the Florentines have the vice of not listening. And you know that in this scene there are no things that flatter the ear, and that to enjoy the beauties, whether of music or of declamation, there must be religious silence. I obtained that, and once the audience had seen me, they remained as if unable to move. In short, to make the matter brief, it gave great pleasure, and after it we were all called out. Things seem to be going pretty well. I really am content. To tell you the truth, I would have been very unhappy if this opera had failed, and I am the more content because it is all Bellini's work. There were people to say, how does Malibran happen to change the last scene? It seems to me that, as a singer who is said to be such an actress, she should be content. Does this seem to you a small triumph? For Ronzi de Begnis, it may have been a small triumph. For Bellini, it was a great one. I Capuleti e I Montecchi is one of his most touching, poignant, personal operas. The scale is intensely human. Everything is in the service of the story. In the hands of the great Italian composers of the early 19th century, bel canto is a tool through which to create drama in music.
Philip Gossett, the Robert W. Renneker Distinguished Service Professor of Music and the Humanities at the University of Chicago. He's an authority on bel canto opera and has written a book on the performance of Italian opera. Another authority on bel canto opera is our conductor for this lyric opera production of Bellini's I Capuleti e I Montecchi, Bruno Campanella. In a conversation with the maestro, I asked him what he thinks of Bellini's skill in writing for the voice.
For the voices, he knows exactly the voice. Maybe he's the best composer for voices. And it's true that if one singer won't really go ahead in his career, he must do many Bellini, because Bellini doesn't destroy the voice. It's always a medicine for the voice.
Yes.
Really, it's so good written for the voice that this is the other side of Bellini.
How did you come to be so fascinated with bel canto yourself?
I don't know. The first thing was Traviata that I studied, and I started to cry as a little child. I can't stop to cry. And Traviata, I tell you, is bel canto. It's not the second Verdi. Traviata is still bel canto. Mm-hmm. So from Traviata, I was completely enthusiastic. I was completely in love, fall in love for bel canto. And it's during also now. It's the same.
Very good.
It's not stopped.
I also asked Maestro Campanella to tell us what for him is special about this opera.
I think that the most important thing, not only in this opera, but in all the operas of bel canto operas, is follow the words. The words are so important for the musical phrase. So, practically, the words suggest if rallentare or accelerare, rallentando or accelerando, to make in music. It's not written from the composer, from Bellini or from Donizetti, rallentando, accelerando, but was a tradition of these times, a tradition to do rallentando, accelerando with the means of the phrase. what the phrase means. I don't want to say that it's very easy to do bel canto, but it's easier than just follow the music and.
But is not so easy because it's a very special quality. The matter of rubato, that sort of thing, it's rarely done in this music, but you do it.
Thank you very much. You know, for me, the bel canto is my love. Is the love of my life. I would like that the traditions of bel canto that are not a written tradition, it's just oral tradition. I would like that this tradition continues. Also, with Italian singers, sometimes they forget the tradition of bel canto. For example, they sing Amor with the R final, final R, that we don't have in Italian, absolutely don't have. Bel canto is vowel.
All vowels, yes.
It's just this.
You
this
were quoted once as saying, it's a shame that all of the words are not vowels only, no consonants.
So I want to save these traditions. It's not only this one, of course. Bel canto is many things more, but more and more they forget really what is bel canto. Also in Italy, unfortunately, also in Italy.
That was our conductor for today's opera, Bruno Campanella, a man making his lyric opera debut in this performance.